Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
The Print Off the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in association with global insurance brokers, airline partner SpiceJet, and in association with Jindal Steel and Power Limited.
I'm so happy to be welcoming Vikram Sampath to this edition of Off the Cuff. The reason I say I'm so happy, yes, one, of course, the second volume of his magnum opus biography of historiography of Savarkar, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar is out. So that's a moment of joy for him and for his friends and fans. But also because he is recovering from really a nasty bout of COVID. And you don't want to hear the details of what he went through. But he's a tough character, I can see that, because he's been through the worst kind of COVID in the second wave. So you seem to be repairing your lungs quite nicely, Vikram. So happy to see you. So happy to see you smiling. Congratulations on the second volume.
Thank you.
Readers will see on the screen. In fact, they'll see both volumes on the screen. And as I get started, let me just ask you about a problem that we have in India. So how do you deal with these complex characters with their contradictions? Not everything about them is perfect. As Nehru once said about Gandhi, I think probably to Richard Attenborough, that show him as he was. When he mentioned to him that one day I might make a film on Gandhi, warts and all. If you read Gandhi's own autobiography, he's not afraid of revealing his warts. But we tend to either deify people or demonize people. So in a situation like that, how do you deal with somebody like Savarkar? Because, this is the time of call-out culture, cancel culture. You and I, you may be cancelled for writing these two books by some. I may be cancelled for just having the temerity to have a conversation with you about the book without telling you that you are a so-and-so. And it can happen on the other side also, right? It happens equally. So how do you then judge these complex, fascinating characters?
Thank you, Shekhar. It's always so wonderful to be in conversation with you. And sadly, we're not having it, sitting next to each other. But nonetheless, I think with the virtual platform, it's always good to meet. I think you hit the nail on the head that history has been a casualty more so in current times, where, as some famous historian had said, all accounts of history are interim reports. There's nothing absolute about any work of history. But sadly, in our country, and particularly today, when I think we live in a world of binaries where there's nothing about nuance that we can understand. Everyone wants to box everyone else into some corner and put labels on them as this and that, as you rightly pointed out. It becomes very, very problematic to judge characters of the past, particularly people like Savarkar. There are others also. And after this, I'm working on two biographies of two contentious and also topical characters. One is Tipu Sultan and the other is Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. Right. People who intrude modern contemporary political discourse and public discourse in a manner that very few characters of the past do. And then an objective assessment of them, which is necessary, becomes so clouded with all the political baggage and the social media noise and all of that. But I think for a historian to get deviated by all of this and to get scared or to start pandering to lobbies to ensure that his or her work gets the attention, I think that is wrong. A historian is committed to his profession of throwing light on the extant records, and that's exactly what I've done with both these volumes. Savarkar has, of course, as you rightly said, been a bone of contention, a very contentious figure, but he's hardly been academically and scholarly, in a scholarly manner, been analyzed and studied. His works largely in Marathi, which lot of mainstream historians did not even access. And still, the last biography of his was written in the 1960s when he was still alive by Dhananjay Keer. And since then till now, though he is a part of election manifestos of political parties, he's a part of rallies, there are defamation cases, all of this happening all the time. But I'm so amazed by the singular lack of any kind of, academic, interest or scholarship, even among the historians. And the political parties who are both his opponents as well as his proponents, the latter more so, to try to understand what the man they even eulogize so much stands for in real sense. So I think that becomes a real problem where we start judging characters of the past by definitions and yardsticks of today, and not looking at them, in their context of the times in which they lived and the circumstances of which they were a product of.
So Vikram, what you've done, you robbed me of my next question, and you mostly answered it. So my next question would have been that such a fascinating character, Savarkar, loved, adored, hated, derided, right? A great fighter, Veer Savarkar, an apologist who actually gave a written apology to get out of a bad jail. With all that, why has it taken so long for a definitive book with so much documentation? Because the amazing thing is, the one thing the British did was they left a lot of documentation behind, as did the leaders of that generation, right? They were not sending each other SMSs or WhatsApps. Right. They were writing letters. So why has it taken so long? Is it because, I'm not leading you in, but is it because in Indian scholarship, there was a worry about him, that how do you write about him, or was it because he was dismissed as a lightweight?
According to me, Shekhar, there are two reasons. One is, of course, in the political circuit, he was, of course, a persona non grata. And that more so, after his implication in Mahatma Gandhi's murder, of which, of course, he was acquitted and so on. But still, that moral albatross, as Sardar Patel too had written to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee and said, legally, one may be exonerated, but the moral judgment remains and so on. So that taint was somehow, and it was also, I would say, a machination of the government of the time to ensure all the political opponents were shown their place and there was no semblance of a political opposition. So for the longest time, forget biography, Shekhar. I mean, even someone like Hridaynath Mangeshkar, the Mangeshkar family was so close to Savarkar's. Lataji used to sing most of his songs, Jayostute and Sagra, Pran Tadmalala, considering the, very prolific Marathi poet that he was. Just for the fact that Hridaynath Mangeshkar, who used to work in the All India Radio, would set Savarkar's poems to tune and have his sisters record it. He actually lost his job at the All India Radio. So much for intolerance post 2014. We know where intolerance actually began, where you can't even tune the poems of a political opponent. So in such a scenario, obviously, the fear of losing one's livelihood and the taint of association, even by a long measure, probably kept a lot of people, even in the political circuit, the public discourse, to talk openly and freely about this man. When it comes to academic and historiography, for the longest time after independence, there's been just one shade of ideological history that has been allowed to rule the roost. There's been no parallel narrative. There's been no alternative voice in a discipline which always, as I said, it's an interim report. So there are multiple versions. There needs to be a lot of dissent, discussion, debate, which the dominant, and I name it as the Marxist historiography, which ruled the roost and which ensured that anybody who was talking or writing anything different gets cancelled. They lost their livelihoods again. Scholars would lose fellowships. They would lose their university jobs. So who would take the gauntlet of actually, risking their lives and talking about this? So you'd rather have the Darbari historians who will write biographies after biographies of Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru and all of them, which is, maybe we need to revisit characters of the past. But then of late, there's been, I think, an attempt to revisit and reevaluate several of them. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, the revolutionary movement itself. But in all of that, I again found it very perplexing that Savarkar escaped this evaluation. People were scared of touching this subject for some reason. Again, maybe the taint of labeling, association, what God knows. But I would broadly say these were the two main reasons why people shockingly did not invest much time in a man they both hated and reviled to a great extent, which says a lot about Indian scholarship.
The other question where you read my mind was Tipu Sultan, because you live in Bangalore. So Tipu Sultan is such a polarizing character. But again, he had shades. He did terrible things to Hindus in Coorg and elsewhere, but he also gave money to a lot of the temples. So when you do your book on Tipu Sultan, will that be at the back of your mind? Do we expect a portrait like that that shows all sides of him?
Indeed, certainly. I'm not the one to censor or remove any aspect of history, because as I said, a historian needs to be true to his or her profession, which is to illuminate the records. Not even go so much into interpretation, I feel, because it's finally a subjective interpretation. And as a historian, a writer, I have the luxury of committing my thoughts to print. Why can't we trust the intelligence of a discerning reader to make up his or her mind after seeing all the records which are made accessible to all of them? So same with Tipu Sultan. I mean, he's almost made into some kind of a mystic saint. He was not. He was a politician. So running with the hare and hunting with the hounds, appeasement of the Hindus when it needed to be done, brutalizing them when it needed to be done, was a constant feature of his politics. Of course, it had ideological, underpinnings, considering the faith aspect which implored him to do all of this. But then that wouldn't mean you also whitewash or airbrush the good parts of his regime and administration.
And Shivaji will be another kind of challenge, because anything about Shivaji is so sensitive in Maharashtra.
My God, yes, indeed. After we saw what happened to James Lane and his book, but of course, a lot of historians, I think, also want to be purposely provocative and you talk about someone's lineage and call names to someone's mother and so on, then obviously it probably, but though I always say it's such an irony in a country like ours where we care so little about our heritage crumbling. Tipu Sultan's armories here are just disintegrating. I don't know how the Raigad fort is of Shivaji. I'm sure that's also in a bad shape. But anything about all these holy cows, we will not accept. So an objective biography of even an Ambedkar today, or a Shivaji, or a Periyar, I don't know if it can happen without your effigies being burnt on streets and people getting into the studio sets like they did of Bhansali and all of that. And history becomes such a live battlefield for a group of people who don't care much about their past. That's the classical paradox.
But want to hang on to their version of it.
Yes. True.
So now that we are on this, before we come back to Savarkar, Aurangzeb, is he another character who you think has not been treated by either side, by this side or that? Because were there two sides to him also, or many sides to him, like say to Tipu?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, Jadunath Sarkar's seminal work on Aurangzeb, which sadly is not in circulation, the man actually unearthed all the inscriptions and the farmans, the autobiography of Aurangzeb, got it he learned Persian, he got it out for the first time. But contemporary and particularly Western historians, in a very condescending way, trying to come in and teach us our history and tell us that Aurangzeb was a very peace-loving individual and there were less temples he destroyed than he protected and things like this, then obviously there is going to be a backlash from the other side, which doesn't know how to react to this or respond to this in an intellectual fashion. And so many a times the response is either not articulate or it is violent. And then that you provoke, then you get a response, and then you condemn that response. And so this cycle goes on. And in all of this, I think history becomes a casualty.
Yeah. So you as a historian, and you with a historian with intellect, how would you counter that?
Which the
Aurangzeb issue. Aurangzeb, Audit Rushke's book, which is so polarizing, which gets a lot of this criticism and support at the same time.
Right. As I said, an adherence strictly to the records which speak for themselves. and the records never lie. When you had court historians of Aurangzeb or some of these rulers who were trying to, who were actually taking pride in the fact that the faith of the infidels was being crushed. And that was a royal diktat. I mean, the ulema would ask the ruler that the faith of the kafir had to be subsumed, the idol had to be crushed and put onto the steps of a masjid. I mean, what's wrong? I think India is the only place where in the world where we've not come to terms with these wounds of the past. World over, you have a Holocaust museum, you have all of that where people go relive these bad experiences of the past, and history offers that space where you can heal the wounds and move on for the future. But in our, this miasma of having national unity getting threatened, we try to kind of whitewash these excesses, whitewash these faults, don't state facts as they are. And the more and more the muck you push under the carpet, it's not going to go away. As much of deodorant you're going to spray on it, at some point the stink is going to show up, because facts will have a tendency of showing up sometime or the other. And that's when it manifests itself in contemporary political conflicts or in social conflicts, Ram Janmabhoomi, whatever it is. All of these are manifestations of the same problem, that we have not come to terms with our history. The whole Nehruvian idea of wishing away the evil things of the past to make amends for the future. A young Muslim boy or girl today is not responsible. The albatross of Aurangzeb and Ghazni and Tipu does not lie on his or her shoulders. And on the contrary, whitewashing these excesses just to make yourself, appeal yourself to this community or any particular community is also not required. Tell the truth as it is, heal and move on, build a better future. I think that's the biggest lesson that history has taught world over, but we in India have not learned that.
I walked through Dachau and I could see how preserving the evidence like this actually teaches future generations to accept the truth and then to say that not again.
Yes.
That's important. So, Vikram, coming back to Savarkar, 18 years back, I think it was the last year of the Vajpayee government, that they put and unveiled a portrait of Savarkar in Parliament.
Right.
That was a controversial event. I remember I got a call early morning that day from somebody who's an early riser, which I am not. That is Jairam Ramesh. And he called me and he said, they are putting a portrait of Savarkar. What are you guys doing about it? You should be getting outraged and all that. So I woke up slowly and I said, but did Mrs. Gandhi issue a stamp on him?
Yes.
So first of all, what is his contradiction that Indira Gandhi issuing a stamp on him, making a personal donation to his trust or his library or whatever in his memory, and then our politics turning so sharply divided that there is a big issue over his portrait in Parliament. I mean, issuing a stamp in 1969 or 68, whenever it happened, was a big deal those days.
Right. True. I would say the Shekhar as a the manifestation of the way Indian politics took a turn in the 90s with of course the Ram Janmabhoomi, and then bringing into power the first non-Congress and a BJP-led government. I think in the 1970s, the Congress was still magnanimous enough to assume that the so-called right-wing parties, the Jan Sangh was hardly a force to reckon with, and the BJP was not even born then. And so the right-wing parties are there as some fringe elements. They're not going to...
Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi never called Jan Sangh a Hindu party. She always invariably called it a Banya party.
Which it was anyway, even the Hindu Mahasabha to a large extent. But yes, so they never saw it, I guess, and that's my assessment, that they never saw, the Congress did not see these parties as a threat, so much of a threat that they would unseat them from power. So being generous, and speaking the truth for a change was still par for the course. But I think once Mr. Vajpayee came over, and then for the first time you had a BJP dispensation, which and the things they were doing, whether it was the plaque at Cellular Jail in Savarkar's honor or the portrait in Central Hall of Parliament, all of this rattled them. And since then, this narrative has gained more ground of him being this apologist and a British stooge, a traitor and a Gandhi murderer. All of this was true even when Indira Gandhi said those words of praise for him. So was a Congress Prime Minister, was Rahul Gandhi's grandmother then actually endorsing a murderer, anti-Muslim, a British stooge, a traitor and all of that? And why would she want to do that? So that's something.
Gandhi's assassin.
Sorry?
And Gandhi's assassin.
Yes. Why would she do that? So that clearly shows that this is contemporary politics trying to infiltrate into a narrative of the past. And after 2014, obviously the polarization is so much more, intense. Though, and to get at the BJP, they think the best way is to get at Savarkar, their ideological ancestor. Very few realizing that Savarkar and the RSS were never one. Savarkar was never part of the RSS. He had huge differences of opinion with Golwalkar and the RSS on several issues, which we can talk about. But all of this, as I said, we are not anymore. The public discourse is not one of nuance anymore. Everything is boxes of black and white.
So what were the differences between Savarkar and Golwalkar? Because I noticed that even Imran Khan, when he goes and speaks at the UN General Assembly, brackets them together.
Yes, unfortunately. No, I mean, they were all linked overall to the Saffron Brotherhood. But I think the differences largely came in the fact that, the Hindu Mahasabha, which was the larger body, which had played a role. I mean, Baba Rao Savarkar, Vinayak Savarkar's elder brother, and Narayan Rao, the younger brother, along with other Hindu Mahasabha leaders like Bhai Parmanand and others, they played a major role in ensuring the RSS spread out across the country, including in North India. The RSS used to use the Delhi head office of the Hindu Mahasabha for its drill practices and all of that. So the Hindu Mahasabha automatically assumed that this was our Boy Scouts, our youth wing, so to say. But then Golwalkar wanted, and this started towards the end of Hedgewar's life, where they wanted to chart out a course of their own. They wanted to stay away from politics. Dr. Munje, the earlier president of the Mahasabha, was told by Hedgewar, who was actually his protege, that please don't use our platform to make anti-Congress, speeches. And so Munje was so upset that he started his own youth wing called the Ram Sena. So Savarkar too was so upset with them that he started his Hindu Rashtra Dal. So the RSS wanted to break free and be its own, have its own mind. And the Hindu Mahasabha, and particularly the Savarkarite version of Hindutva, relied on one individual, idolizing one individual, rallying around one individual, even if it was characters of the past, Rama, Krishna, Shivaji, Sambhaji and all of that, or a living person like Savarkar, whereas the RSS believed in the cause being more than, putting all your eggs into one basket of one individual. So the movement moves on, even if a particular individual rises or falls. Maybe one reason why the Hindu Mahasabha petered out, but the RSS continues to remain powerful. So I think these differences and the RSS's refusal to even participate in many of the struggles like the Arya Samaj and the Hindu Mahasabha coming together for the fight of civil rights of Hindus in Nizam's territory. All of this angered Savarkar so much, and he made this very, very abusive and infamous comment that, if there's an epitaph of an RSS Swayamsevak, it'll have only 3 lines. He was born, he joined the RSS, he died. There's no other singular achievement in his life. So, of course, he had to eat his words later. When post-Gandhi murder, he tried to send out an olive branch to the RSS. So, but then that's what I'm saying. The Hindutva too, when we talk of Hindutva, there are so many versions of it. A Godse's version, which, is more violent or whatever, was different from what Savarkar preached or what Golwalkar thought, and so on. So we don't look at these different nuances at all today.
I have some of these questions. I mean, I know I'm pretending to look intelligent and getting away with it, but I have some of these thanks to my colleague who you know well, Rama Lakshmi, our opinion editor. She also looks at the book section, so she's the most literary among us all. Now, Savarkar, a beef-eating rationalist.
Not a beef-eating. He didn't eat beef himself. He said, I don't believe in the cow being worthy of worship, but, it should be protected. And if the cow is being slaughtered only to slight the Hindus, then we, or, in the past, I think even Mr. Modi made this reference of how when this mythical king, Suhail Dev, when he was fighting against the forces of Ghazni, there was a battery of cows that were kept, as a shield by the opponents. And the Hindu side would not shoot their arrows, thinking that Gaumata would be hurt. So that was what Savarkar used to say, that, when it comes to the national honor and, the honor of an individual being much more than that of an animal, then the nation and the human being should take precedence. And we have already 33 crore or whatever number of gods and goddesses. We don't need to add one more to the pantheon, more so an animal which is sitting in its own excreta and all of that. It's a humiliation even for divinity and humanity and all kinds of things. But he said Go Raksha, even Krishna was called Gopala, and someone who protected the cow. So let's use the animal. It's a very utilitarian animal. Even in America, it's used for animal husbandry and improving agricultural output. Let's do that. Let's not worship it. If you want it, do it in the presence of your house. Don't bring it into public policy and into public space. But I don't think he he advocated that we should all go and eat beef. Sorry, that was the correction to the very first adjective on him.
Did he mind people eating beef, those who ate beef?
That's what, as he actually was an advocate of eating non-vegetarian food to everybody. He said, yeah, even when the famine and so on was going on, he said, instead of relying on food grains, there's so much of animal, wealth, you just consume that. And also to be militarily fit, you need to do that, though he was a Chitpavan Brahmin himself. So a lot of such statements which would raise heckles even now, among the Orthodox. So obviously in the 1920s and 30s, that would make him all the more, anathema.
But those times were like that. There was Jinnah. Jinnah ate everything.
Yes.
He drank a bit. He was a non-praying Muslim, but he wanted Pakistan, right? Yeah. Similarly, in more contemporary times, Advani is a non-ritual believing Hindu.
So was Mr. Vajpayee. I mean, not a ritualistic.
No, not a ritualistic. Advani is not a ritualistic Hindu. Yet for him to lead that big yatra for Ram Mandir. So these contradictions continue.
True. I think Savarkar makes it clear, Shekhar, right in his treatise on Hindutva, where right at the beginning he says Hindutva has nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism or about rituals. It was, in my view, twofold. One was, of course, a cultural national identity marker, particularly during the time of the Khilafat movement, where people were being led on a very dangerous path of identity politics based on religion, and that too with extra territorial allegiances outside India, and a support of a community being sought as a premium, for a cause which was not at all Indian. The second was also the political aspect of Hindutva, which was just a political pushback to political Islam. So in both these cases, I don't think the ritual aspect of it ever came into picture, because he himself, I wouldn't call him certainly an atheist, but he would certainly be I don't know, how do we translate into English a word like Nirishwarvad, somebody who was, deeply influenced by Hindu philosophy and scriptures, including in the cellular jail where he read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. The flag of the Hindu Rashtra was also made with the Kundalini, the Kirpan, all of that. So Hindu and Sikh symbols, religious symbols being invoked, but at the same time, not into rituals. He did not want a shraddh performed of himself or of his wife when she died, all of that. So yeah, these contradictions which perhaps I think Hindutva offers that space where it clearly says right in its inception manifesto document that we have nothing to do with the theological aspects of Hinduism, which is a subset of Hindutva, so to say. Hindutva is a larger thing which stands for the national identity, culture. Anybody who thinks of this land as one of their forefathers and a land worthy of allegiance and devotion is a Hindu, irrespective of which faith he or she follows at home, which is a private affair. So
his Hindutva was not linked to Hinduism. It was not a basic requirement.
No, not at all. So in fact, in that treatise, he says, he asks this question and answers it himself, where he says, what do we do with people like Annie Besant or Sister Nivedita, who were not born in India? So it was not their Pitrubhu, the land of their ancestors. But he answers it themselves that, and one of them had converted, the other had not. So what do we do with them? He said they would still be Hindus because they have probably contributed to this country a lot more than indigenous Indians, because the second criteria of Punya Bhu, or their land of, that also is made to sound like it's a land of devotion, the holy land.
So Pitrubhu is fatherland where you were born.
Ancestral. They're also Pitrus. Yeah.
Ancestral, yes.
Yes.
Pitru Paksh, that's why we say
Yes.
ancestral. And Karambhu, you said?
Punya Bhu.
Where you provided
Where, to whom you owe your allegiance, to whom you're devoted to. So anybody who fulfills either or criteria and either or is a Hindu, and he can be a Sikh, Muslim, Christian, Parsi, whatever, but then they would be culturally and nationally called a Hindu, because he also said that's how the world looks at us. When his case was going on at the International Court of Justice at Hague, when he jumps ship at France and is extradited to India, he had a Parsi lawyer called Baptista, but the French records and British records always called him the Hindu lawyer. So he said the rest of the world, the words Indian and Hindu are synonymous. So it's nothing to do with, the religion. One could argue, why didn't he use the term Bharatiya? Because that would have solved the entire problem and not caused all this chaos as to, are you identifying with a religion or so on? But then his answer to that also was, there is a lot to a name, unlike what Shakespeare says, that, the word Hind has a history to it. It has the Sindhu Nadi, and how all the Persian records too, called it Al-Hind and so on. So that this part of the world, on the east of the Indus River was called Hind. So people from there are Hindus. And so on. So he dealt with a lot of semantics, a lot of poetic romance, and also history to come together with this formula of whom he considered as Hindus. And so contrary to popular belief that, the minorities were not part of this scheme, or they would be treated as second-class citizens and all of that, that really was not the case.
So do today's adherents of Hindutva understand this nuance?
I think we've just had something last week with the RSS chief, Dr. Mohan Bhagwat, coming out with something more provocative than this and saying, yeah, there's no difference between any community, particularly the Muslims. We have the same DNA and all of that. I think the difference there was with Golwalkar, who was a little more strident in his bunch of thoughts, where he spoke about the separateness and so on. But there also, I think Dr. Bhagwat disassociated himself. The Sangh from it, saying it was relevant during those times, because finally, Shekhar, as I said, we are judging a lot of statements and actions of characters of the past by today's politics and yardsticks. It was the time when the subcontinent was being sliced apart on the basis of religion. So obviously, a counter narrative to that on the basis of religion was bound to be there, and probably giving them the benefit of doubt. They were doing this on that count. That way, even Dr. Ambedkar's statements on Islam, of how it's a closed corporation, that it's only it sees the whole world as Darul Islam and Darul Harab, and for Islam will never allow an Indian Muslim to consider this land as a land of with full devotion. Today, ironically, you have Ambedkar's photographs on a CAA protest. So Ambedkar would be the first one to oppose that. So we don't look at all of this, or we wouldn't dare to call an Ambedkar as an Islamophobe, but we can very happily call a Savarkar or a Golwalkar that. So I think those differences we don't, see.
So a question from Nitin Vashne from KK Hospital, Aligarh, who says, if Veer Savarkar was a politician in today's India, what would his place be in the politics of today's RSS and BJP?
Oh God, he would have been out of it long back. Because I think again, someone who, the problem was even in his times, and that was a tragedy of the man, that he was not a leader in the sense that he could carry people along. The Hindu Mahasabha, which he of course galvanized so much from being just a tail end organization of the Congress into a political party which was fighting fit for elections and gave a challenge to the Muslim League and the Congress. The kind of intra-party, problems between his faction and the Shama Prasad Mukherjee faction. You had a Maharashtra caucus which was supporting him. You had the North Indian, the landlords, all the Jugal Kishore Birlas and the Maheshwar Dayal Seths of the world, who were more towards Shama Prasad Mukherjee, only because Shama Prasad was a little more conciliatory. He was almost pro-Congress. Gandhi had once jokingly said, Shama Prasad is the congressman in the Hindu Mahasabha, and Patel is the the Hindu Mahasabha guy in the Congress. So so he was almost veering towards that side. So all these dissensions, Savarkar was hardly able to manage, unlike a Gandhi who either through moral blackmail that I'm going to go on a fast if you don't listen to me or whatever, he managed to and those who didn't listen to him were shown the boot like Subhash Chandra Bose was. So he managed to establish his supremacy and dictatorship over a party, which Savarkar failed to, because I think he was a little more liberal Democrat or whatever, allowing all these different voices to come through. So he would not have a place in today's politics, which is so person-centric anyway, in all parties.
Okay, let me get away with that. Kamlesh Sharma from Coca-Cola, who says, do you think that the two narratives on Savarkar, his association with Hindutva organizations and his pardon plea to the British, those have completely dwarfed his contributions and his personality and his historiography?
Completely agree. But there also, there needs to be so much of a knowledge shed, Shekhar, where, I mean, the Hindutva we just discussed, but this whole issue of, he was a stooge, he wrote mercy petition. These were not mercy petitions. They're, in Hindi, you would call them yachika, a petition, which is a very normal, legitimate, tool that was provided not exclusively only to him. It was given to almost all the political prisoners. So, Ram Prasad Bismil and the whole Kakori, case, people who were imprisoned, they got a mercy petition, a petition written on their behalf. Madan Mohan Malviya sent it to the government. Tilak wrote a petition. There were so many people. Sachindranath Sanyal wrote a petition. The founder of the HRA and the leader of the revolutionaries. So several people who were given like a life term. Savarkar had 50 years of imprisonment, a double transportation for life. So rather than rotting in jail, and if you're given the option, particularly during the World War, when you had the colonies across the world, as a matter of goodwill, political prisoners were being released. And the way to release them was everyone had to give a petition saying, I have been, imprisoned, and so I need to go away after a particular period of imprisonment. So it's very much like a bail that is being sought today. So why is that made to be, when it's allowed in law, just as you can have a lawyer to argue your case, if you're given the agency of a petition, that doesn't mean you're a stooge, because if he were a stooge, after his release from Ratnagiri in 1924, he was released conditionally with two conditions. One was you're not going to participate in politics for 5 years. And the second is you are going to be confined to Ratnagiri and not move anywhere out. Now, if he had become a stooge by then, at the end of the 5 years, he should have been released by the British, because somebody who's on your side, it's always good to let them free, or also get him into the government, because from 1937, the Congress party was forming governments across the country. But contrary to that, the government records, which I state in the book as well, keep saying that, his conduct is something that we don't trust. So it was an extension of this period of confinement from 29 to 31, 31 to 33, 33 to 35, and he was released finally in 1937. So 13 years of captivity. Why would the British do that to somebody who's on your side and who's a stooge? So that itself clearly showed that during those 13 years, there were lots of underground linkages that Savarkar and his brothers maintained with the revolutionary movement, whether it was Bhagat Singh, whether it was Azad, Rash Bihari Bose, and later Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose as well, Sachindranath Sanyal, all of them operating underground. And this I illuminate in the book as well, saying that was one of the reasons why the British were so suspicious of him till the time he was finally released in 1937. And this whole fact that he got a pension from the British because he had become their stooge. This pension business was again given to all the revolutionaries who had come back from cellular jail. The Bengal revolutionaries got something like 100 rupees a month of pension. And Savarkar too, when he applied for it in 1924, when he was released, it was not granted. It was only when his release was further extended several years, that's when, while all the others got 100 rupees, he got 60 rupees a month after a lot of cuts that were imposed by the governor of Bombay. And that was available only till the time he was released from captivity. Growing family, there's no source of income. All his degrees were snatched away from him, though he had a law degree from London. His bachelor's degree from Fergusson College, Pune, was also taken away. So there was no way of earning. All his writings that he was doing as a journalist, Shraddhanand and so on, those were under surveillance. He could not write freely. He could not earn his living. So obviously the only thing this was a scheme, again, the government had not exclusively only for Savarkar, but for several political prisoners to rehabilitate them, they would be given a pension. So both these things, he got a pension, he wrote mercy petitions, so he had sold out to the British. I think these are narratives which urgently need historical correction in the light of what actually the records are.
So my young colleague Shubhangi Mishra asks you a question on this because she's read from journalist Niranjan Takle, who's taken out one of these petitions, and she's reading from that petition, quote, I am ready to serve the government in any capacity they like. The mighty alone can afford to be merciful, and therefore, where else can the prodigal son return but to the parental doors of the government? In 1913, mercy petition, or whatever petition. Is that correct? And what does it mean?
So there too, Shekhar, I mean, even including that last line is taken, I remain yours obedient servant. And so, this was a format of how when you're appealing for applying for a bail today to the Supreme Court or something, you can't be defiant and say, I'm seeking a bail, and use a language which is very, very rude. So something very similar. And during that time, you had the Morley Minto reforms, the constitutional reforms coming into play. And the Congress was actually willing to support the government in the constitutional reforms. So in fact, Gandhi himself writes a petition on behalf of the Savarkar brothers and says these were brave men. They fought, in the revolution, and they got they faced this punishment. Now they want to join the mainstream, and so why don't you allow them? So today, when Naxals and terrorists and all of these people, even in Kashmir, you had hardcore terrorists who then join electoral politics and the mainstream, and we welcome them. We seek for clemency for Yaqub Memon. We seek the clemency for everyone. Ajmal Kasab and everyone. So similarly, if someone is willing to get into the mainstream of politics, what is the point of keeping them in confinement? But what the revolutionaries did was they used to sign these petitions. Sachindranath Sanyal also signed a petition like this saying, I will never, take part in this thing, and I will be completely loyal to the British government. Please let me out. And 1 year later, he goes and forms the HRA and then orchestrates the Kakori case. So the British also knew that the petitions were not even worth the paper that they were written on. So they didn't take it seriously. And that is why Sachindranath Sanyal, in his book, Mera Bandi Jeevan, he writes, I was advised by Savarkar to file a petition, or hu bahu waisa hi petition maine bhi dala tha, but I was released, but the Savarkar brothers were not released. And that was because the government thought of them as D category or dangerous criminals. And they felt that if they were released, then the revolutionary zeal, which had fizzled out in the Bombay presidency, it would get reignited. So obviously, these petitions, their language had to follow the format of the times, and it was with the intention to get out. But what you did after getting out, that was a completely different thing. And if one actually quotes that also in his 1917 petition, which I shall then quote, where he says, if my name constitutes an obstacle in the release of all the other political prisoners, then delete my name and release the others, and that would give me as much joy as my own release would do. So which also shows that he was acting as a spokesperson, for all the other prisoners who were all young and largely, illiterate, didn't know English, didn't know the law. They used to call him Bada Babu, the Bada Babu who's come from London. So I think that thing is very essential for us to know, rather than pick and choose. In isolation, if you take so many, that way during the same time, 1913 to 17, Mahatma Gandhi was recruiting people for the First World War. He had supported the British in the Boer War, the Zulu conflict. He had got a medallion also for loyalty to the British crown during this time, which he later gave up after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So I think context is very important, rather than pick and choose selectively.
Because characters evolve over time.
Yes.
And
True.
they relate to the context is the timing. Now, something that I found very interesting. You mentioned that nugget about a little Savarkar, a child Savarkar, wanting to make bombs to blow up the mosques. You could have passed it. Why did you still mention it?
It was not a bomb. So I think the 1890s, Maharashtra was a tinderbox. And I mentioned those documents too, where Hindu-Muslim conflicts were on the rise all the time. And if you see, so I've also quoted, the works of someone none less than Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who in his Kesari took a very, very strident, move, because the conflicts were on two grounds, cow slaughter, again, the same issue that we face even now, and the question of music processions in front of mosques. And on this, people would kill each other and there would be riots all over Maharashtra. And Tilak and Kesari, advocated that this was all, the British government was actually appeasing the Muslims. They were given, the freedom to do what they want, but the Hindu community was put strictures on. And so that's why I will defy it. And so the Shivaji Utsavs and the Ganpati Utsavs would be more flamboyant, with a lot of music, a lot of processions, a lot of all of that. So a young boy like Savarkar, like several others in Maharashtra, would somewhere be imbibing all of this that they were seeing, they were reading in newspapers. So the constant thing that we need to oppose them, and we need to, that was constantly a part of the political discourse, the public discourse, and mainstream discourse, even on the part of someone like a Tilak. So this was a playful game where they would all arm themselves, and he was the leader of this boy army, and go and throw stones and vandalize. And it was not a mosque that was in use, it was a mosque which was not in use and deserted for several decades. But do that and then say, we have won against them. So, but I mentioned it particularly because, as you rightly said, people evolve. So someone like this was also in London, somebody who spoke about Hindu-Muslim unity, somebody who did not whitewash the contributions of a Bahadur Shah Zafar. In fact, his that 1857 book that he wrote, which he called the First War of Indian Independence, it praises profusely, Bahadur Shah Zafar. It ends with a share on Bahadur Shah Zafar. He wrote Urdu ghazals himself, Savarkar, in jail. 2-3 of those ghazals have come out, and some of the musicians have actually put them to tune. So there was that aspect of his life too in London. But then cellular jail changed him, which was also the time of the Khilafat movement. So the love-hate relationship between Savarkar and the Muslims, I think that trajectory needed to be mapped somewhere, saying how he was reacting to the politics and the social circumstances of his times, whether it was during the time of Tilak or it was Gandhi's movement, or what he was personally facing in the cellular jail.
So Khilafat movement is, just for the younger people who may not have read so much history, Khilafat is actually caliphate. And that is when the big power shift was going on in Turkey after Ottomans had lost the war. And there was a worldwide movement among Muslims to save the caliphate. And that was quite prevalent in India also, quite strong. And Gandhi then decided to support it because he thought this will help Hindu-Muslim unity. Am I correct?
True.
Summarizing that, yes.
Yes.
And that affected Savarkar.
Yes. because a premium was being put that the Muslims were not participating in the non-cooperation movement. In fact, the Khilafat movement was launched first, and then the non-cooperation was tagged onto it, where you participate. It's a barter system. You participate in this, in return we will help you in that. So why should that be? In fact, R.C. Majumdar, the historian, says by doing this, Gandhi himself somewhere tacitly said that Muslims are not, I mean, the issues of this country don't matter to them. Those they belong to some other place, that some other nation which they consider holy is what matters to them. Who is a caliph there? When the people of Turkey themselves did not want the caliph, and you had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk coming, after the World War, why were we mobilizing Indian Muslims on an emotive religious issue? And Gandhi also made the promise that within 1 year, if you participate in this, I will establish the caliphate there and I will get Swaraj. Now, neither of this happened. And the consequences were disastrous because the mobs then went on a rampage. You had Hindu carnages all through the 1920s, including the assassination of Swami Shraddhanand of the Arya Samaj, the Mopla carnage in Malabar, to all of which Gandhi was rather silent. And even Ambedkar says this was too heavy a price to pay for the mythical illusion of Hindu-Muslim unity.
I have Vaibhav Shah from Vodafone Global Services, who says if you see Savarkar's writings, all his views run counter to Gandhi's, including, say, on cinema. I mean, what are the areas where you might find some agreement between them?
None. I don't think any. So in an article somewhere I'd written, so just as I think their portraits hang on opposite sides of the Central Hall of Parliament, I think they are two opposite poles of Indian history, and the twain shall never meet. And these are the multiple ideas of India. There is no the idea of India, the hallowed version which we all swear our allegiance to all the time and bemoan its decline. I think there are different ideas, and these were two very, very contesting ideas. And in their life too, when Gandhi meets Savarkar in Ratnagiri, when he comes there, the two of them have a very hot debate about Shuddhi and about untouchability and all of that. And at the end, Gandhi says, our thoughts will never meet, but I hope you will allow me to do my experiments. And Savarkar, the parting shot, which kind of ruffles Gandhi, and I quote that, he says, you may do your experiments, Mahatma Ji, but then you're doing it at the cost of the nation. So the nation will pay a very heavy price for these experiments that you are trying. And Gandhi had no answer, and he walked away, and the two of them never met after that. And ironically, the same man also gets implicated in his murder. So I think these two hero, anti-hero kind of thing of modern Indian history, they would never meet, and that's perfectly fine. I think we need to have a counter narrative, a counter example to every dominant narrative that we have, I guess.
Now, there's a question you've been asked 100 times, but I have a viewer who otherwise we would have hosted
yes,
at an event and served them some food and wine, which unfortunately we can't do in these times, COVID times.
Yeah.
Dr. S.B. Kotwal, he is referring to Manohar Balgaokar's book that Savarkar gave the revolver to Godse for assassinating Gandhi. Is that true? No,
not at all. In fact, the revolver was not even got in Bombay. It was got from Gwalior, from Dr. Parchure, who was also one of the accused in the case. So the entire edifice of the Gandhi murder for which Savarkar was implicated was on the basis of a police approver called Digambar Badge, who this was the only thing that, he gave the version to the police. The police had botched up this case so badly, Shekhar, and that's something I bring out in the case, details shocked me. There are 11,000 pages of the Gandhi murder trial I went through from the National Archives. And, in fact, the government of India, the government of Bombay facilitated the murder of Gandhi. On 20th of January 1948, the first attempt was made on his life. Between 20th and 30th of Jan, the Nagarwala, who was the commissioner in Bombay, and the Sanjeevi, who was in Delhi, between them, they let a lot of clues pass. They did not take into account so many hints that were coming about to ensure that Gandhi's life was saved. And Gandhi was made a literal sitting duck, and which is what I think even Tushar Gandhi mentions in his book, Let's Kill Gandhi, where, and somewhere you needed all kinds of fall guys within the Congress. You needed to somehow keep insinuating that Sardar Patel, was a little lax in security because he was the home minister. Though during that period, Sardar Patel had almost left the home ministry. He had a huge fight with Nehru. He was planning to leave the Congress. Minutes before Gandhi's murder, the two of them were meeting, and Gandhi was trying to patch him and Nehru up. So you needed to do this with people outside, inside the government, and outside the government, you needed a fall guy. And so Savarkar became that, where Badge's statement that Godse, Apte, and all of these guys went to Savarkar Sadan, met him, and while coming back, he said Yashasvi houn ya in Marathi, which said Yashasvi ho ke vapas aao. So that was the only proof on the basis of which he was he was implicated. And that is why the honorable judge of the court, Justice Atmacharan, went through this voluminous documentation, went through all the evidences, the witnesses, and he was exonerated, not, as is said, for lack of evidence, but for lack of any association with the crime. That's what the words of the final judgment say. Where Savarkar probably, you have those accounts too, that I think at that point he got so scared that he's going to meet yet another cellular jail episode. So he eschewed all kinds of association with Godse. And there's that famous quote that he would not even look at Godse in the Red Fort trial. Godse was yearning for a touch of Tatyara or a glance of, affection, but that was not to be. I think that's where he went to the extreme, saying, I don't even know them. I have no association, though they were part of the Hindu Rashtra Dal, the Boy Scouts of the Hindu Mahasabha. But his association in the murder per se, it has not been, proved then. And in fact, as late, and this is something I don't know, the media also did not highlight so much. In 2018, you had Justice Bobde and Justice Nageshwar Rao on the basis of a PIL that was filed on the Kapoor Commission, where it said that he was implicated. An amicus curiae was appointed, and in March 2018, this bench came out with the verdict that we went through the entire Gandhi murder trial cases. We went through even the Kapoor Commission report, and there is no evidence of Savarkar's involvement in it. The Kapoor Commission too does not prove that, it just states it without any proof. And a commission does not have the power to overturn the verdict of a court. And so the applicant, the PIL was filed by this man called Pankaj Phadnis. So the applicant's assertion that Savarkar was implicated in the murder by the Kapoor Commission is itself erroneous. Those were what the honorable judges said as late as 3 years ago. But still, we will keep, hanging this albatross on this man and denying him his due.
Something very interesting came up reading Kumi Kapoor's latest book on the Parsis.
Yes.
And that is the fascinating story of Bhikaji Kama. That how friendly she became with Savarkar.
Yes.
And how she even covered for Savarkar over the revolvers. So what is that story and what was this association?
So in the 5 years that Savarkar was a student at London, under Shyamji Krishna Varma and the India House, where he was the unelected leader of sorts, that became a hotbed of sedition. And the entire Indian freedom movement kind of moved to Europe, to Paris, to London, because there the sedition laws were not so strong. You carry out anti-government propaganda. So people like Savarkar, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Sarojini Naidu's brother, Madan Lal Dhingra, then you had MPT Acharya, VVS Iyer, Sardar Singh Rana, several, Lala Hardayal of the Gadar party, all of them were operating from there. And so was Bhikaji Kama, who had left India. And initially she was working for Dadabhai Nauroji and then got very disillusioned with the whole pacifism and took to the more violent means of attaining freedom. And she and Savarkar had a very close bond. In fact, the flag that was designed by Savarkar and Hemchandra Kanungo of the Anushilan Samiti, that was unfurled by her at the first International Socialist Conference at Stuttgart in Germany. And even when Savarkar was facing a case in London, she financed a lot of that. And even after he went away to Kalapani, his family was devastated because his entire property was confiscated by the government, including utensils of the house. So the women of the house and all the brothers were in jail. The three brothers, the younger one was later let out and he started his own medical practice. But the two elder brothers were in jail. They were socially ostracized by the people. So sustaining their livelihood was so difficult for them. And Madam Bhikaji Kama used to send money to the Savarkar family to sustain themselves for a very, very long time, till the time Vinayak Savarkar came back, from jail. So there are lots of these linkages between these firebrand revolutionaries, which we've sadly, in this narrative of our Indian freedom struggle, and that too in the 75th year when we are heading there, we don't even hear these stories or these people and their Braveheart stories. We just have a very simplistic, linear, monochromatic Attenborough kind of film thing which is put in our heads, and governments and after governments of whichever hue, they follow the same prototype set because no one has the courage to dismantle that.
So I have a couple of last questions. There is Minhaj Ahmed Ansari of Larsen and Toubro who says, if you have to describe Veer Savarkar in 2 to 3 sentences to this generation, who's definitely conflicted, which is definitely conflicted about him, what would you say?
That's a interesting question. I would say a man who was far ahead of his times, who did not understand that to make reforms, you couldn't adopt a nihilist approach. You had to take people along, which he probably did not. I mean, he had very strong views on several issues, including caste eradication of untouchability, Hindutva normally associated with Manuvad and all of that. But here was the father of Hindutva who stood for intercaste marriage, intercaste dining, temple entry for all, schools for children of all classes, and a complete eradication, not just of untouchability as Gandhi propounded, but a dismantling of the Varna system itself, which he thought was the basic, the bedrock of all the discrimination. And his views and that of Ambedkar on caste being so similar. So someone who was a rationalist, who was far ahead of his times, but a horrible leader who could not, carry people along or convince them of his views, because it would be so difficult for them to probably see his point of view.
Okay, Javed Saidi, who wants to know who would you name having social reformer in their profiles, or who would you name having social reformer profiles for their faith, of course? Mr. Savarkar okay, I get the question. Who would be similar to Mr. Savarkar in terms of their social reformer profile among Christians, Judaism, and Islam?
Wow, that's going to be I'm not too sure how many, particularly in the Muslim community. Of course, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who at least brought English education to the Muslims and got the Aligarh Muslim University and so on. But a lot of the social issues, discrimination within the society or against other communities, not too sure if he, came there. So very tough to find parallels like that.
Yeah. And the last question, and the big question, but easy to answer.
Okay.
This is Sahil Tuhab, who says, dear sir, during 2019 elections, Rahul Gandhi said that his name was Rahul Gandhi, not Rahul Savarkar, on being asked to apologize to BJP for something he said. So how would you respond to that? Was it immaturity or ideology or both?
What do we say about Rahul Gandhi, Shekhar? But yeah, as we discussed earlier, so, the contradiction that then he'd really need to explain why his grandmother did all that she did to venerate him? Was she playing to the galleries? Was she also a stooge? Was she also complicit in Gandhi's murder? So why would she honor a person who was, so sorry about everything? In fact, even I think when you tweeted about this, or the print tweeted about it, I was seeing a lot of comments were about that, oh, it's sorry worker, and all these kind of insinuations which continue to this day. The problem is that you chant a lie 100 times and generation after generation, and it starts assuming the shade of a truth. But I think what I've attempted to do is, I've always said I'm not an apologist for Savarkar. I am not his advocate. As I've in this conversation too, if you noticed, I brought out a lot of his negative aspects as well, because I'm sure he deserves a better lawyer than me. But at the same time, this painting of someone and actually demeaning someone's sacrifices, somebody who suffered so much. I mean, 14 years of jail, in cellular jail, with the most inhuman conditions, 13 more years of captivity. So 27 years of a man's, active life led completely under captivity. And the kind of sufferings that the family also underwent, as I mentioned, his wife, Yamuna Bai, his sister-in-law, Yeshu Vahini, his brother Baba Rao, the younger brother Narayan Rao, their careers were destroyed. Their children continue to, be in, anonymity. They don't have a great life like most of the other dynasts. They've not entered politics. So to demean somebody who sacrificed so much for the country, who formed India's first secret society, who organized the first ever bonfire of foreign clothes in 1905, protesting against the partition of Bengal, who led the Indian revolutionary struggle, as I mentioned, outside India in London, who championed social reforms, and who was an active voice of the Hindu community at a time when political Islam was at its ascendant, threatening to and succeeding in vivisecting the subcontinent, to speak so childishly and in a juvenile fashion without understanding the complexities or the historical truths. We can't expect much from politicians of all hues, but I think to bring the discourse to such a low level and settle scores with someone you can't even match up to, or someone who's not there to defend himself or herself, I think that's a very low kind of a thing to do. For what? To take a jibe at your political opponent whom you get defeated by in every election. I think that's a very, very, very low life kind of a act.
Finally, a question. Mihir wants to know, when will the Marathi edition of your first volume come out?
I think in a couple of weeks it should be out. It's
Fantastic. So I know that it will have a great readership in Maharashtra.
The Hindi one as well, in fact.
People read with open mind. So thank you very much, Vikram. You've made a great contribution with this rich literature to our understanding of a very rich and fascinating character from our history. And now, as you move on to Tipu Sultan and Shivaji,
more landmines.
Is each one of those also going to be 2 volumes this thickness?
I guess so, unless my publishers, put a, diktat to me saying, we're printing too many pages.
No, I think your readers and buyers will not complain. So people go buy these books. It's always important to understand our history, and this is fairly recent history. We can't just ignore, or we cannot cancel people from our history, whether we like them or not. It's important to study them. So thank you very much, Vikram, for making that fantastic contribution, and keep on getting better and better and keep smiling like this.
Thank you, Shekhar.
We'll send you a t-shirt, I defeated COVID.
Oh, wow. That would be the most important. Thank you.